Hey, it's a girl, Autumn. I'm here to talk to you about my second favorite Pretend Wizard game. This is my presentation on how Magic the Gathering players build their skill through gameplay and social interaction. So, Magic the Gathering is a trading card game that was created by Richard Garfield and released in 1993 by Wizards of the Coast. Magic the Gathering is the first trading card game, and today it's arguably the most popular it's ever been, with record breaking sales over the last couple of years. Uh, Without going into too much detail of how it's played, Magic is a trading card game, meaning players purchase booster packs of cards and either use them to build decks to play with or trade them with other players. Considering a lot of mainstream conversations around Magic either centers on the secondary market of selling cards or how complex the gameplay is, I think it's really important to mention it's a deeply social game with a very rich metagame. Richard Garfield broadly defines metagaming as how a game interfaces with life. For the purposes of this study, I'm going to focus in a bit and define metagaming as anything that happens outside of a game that you bring to it when you play. This includes players trading cards between games, talking shop about the state of the game, uh, crafting a box to put their decks in, and most commonly when players discuss their strategies with one another. And that's what I find so interesting about Magic's metagame. Magic is a zero-sum game with a highly collaborative community around it. It doesn't matter if the most casual or cutthroat players sit across from each other, they will both likely try to win, and if the game they will both try to win, and the game will likely end with them debriefing on how it could have gone differently. To keep things brief, I'm going to refer to this discussion around gameplay as meta chat. Players openly offer advice to each other on how to play better, and they trade decks and talk about how they could be improved. I want to know why players would freely share their strategies with their opponents who will only use them against them next time they try to kill each other in their cardboard wizard fight. So, my first research question is, why do players engage in meta chat? Self determination theory is a motivational theory that looks at factors that promote or undermine motivation, both intrinsic and extrinsic. I'm mostly going to be using a mini theory within SDT called Basic Psychological Needs Theory. When it comes to games, it looks at the impact that playing them has on someone's well being based on satisfying their needs. There are three basic needs related to psychological wellness: autonomy, which is volition or control over your actions. In this context, it would look like when you play for the love of the game. Competence has to do with needing a challenge or feeling effective. In this context, that would be wanting to build skill by facing equally competent opponents. And then finally, relatedness, which is a need to feel connected to others. That's being motivated by the social aspects of the game. In their study, Ryan Rigby and Shabelsky contend that games that give people feelings of autonomy, competence, and relatedness motivate them to keep playing. So, my first hypothesis is that players' motivations for engaging in meta chat will largely fall in line with the three basic needs outlined in BPN. So, question two: what effects does meta chat have on players? While Magic is a game that's played all over the world, it primarily exists in local metas or dynamic ecosystems of players and strategies that influence one another through gameplay and the social dynamic in which the games exist. Metas can be as small as a few friends that get together every couple weeks or be the entire customer base of a local gaming store. It's also important to note that these dynamic metas are not completely self contained. Although certain players or play groups will have preferred formats or play styles, players freely move between metas, taking what they learn from one game to another. Unsurprisingly, the majority of learning how to play Magic happens while playing the game. Using Linderoth's ecological approach to learning gameplay, we can examine how players improve by how they recognize and act on affordances in the game. According to Linderoth, the primary idea in ecological psychology is that the biological functions for perception and action that all living things have form dynamic systems with the environment that these beings inhabit. Basically, objects in our environment all offer us different ways of acting on them or affordances, and these affordances are always relevant to the individuals acting on them. So, for example, a tall shelf would not afford me being able to reach it, while a taller person might be afforded the ability to reach up to it. In gaming, this often appears as experienced players recognizing affordances in the game that less experienced players may not notice. An experienced Magic player will look at their opponent's resources to see when a counterspell is afforded to them and play carefully. An inexperienced player will throw their full weight into casting a spell that summons a massive creature, only to have that spell countered by their opponent. In that moment, the inexperienced player learns to recognize the trap and becomes more experienced. In the future, this player will take exploratory actions to attempt to perceive any affordances that their opponent might have against them before they take their own performatory actions to utilize any affordances they have before they take any performatory actions to utilize any affordances that they have available to them. As it relates to meta chat, exploratory actions can also take place outside of the game. After the game, the two players may discuss how the inexperienced player could have avoided that trap. As a result, they become more experienced. They may even make alterations to their deck in order to set a few traps of their own in the future. This greater experience and these changed cards will lead to a wider range of performatory actions that the player can use, in turn giving them more to explore. My second set of hypotheses are that players that engage in meta chat will be more likely to make changes to their gameplay relative to players that do not engage in meta chat. And my second in the set is that players that engage in meta chat will be more likely to make changes to their decks relative to players that do not engage in meta chat. Based on what I could find, I don't think metagaming is discussed enough in communication theory contexts. This is likely because metagaming is a very broad concept, and the most common usage of it is as the meta of a game, which refers to the commonly understood set of strategies players use in a given context, which is usually in digital gaming and usually in digital competitive gaming. Additionally, in tabletop role-playing games, metagaming has negative connotations because it means something completely different than how I've been using it here. There were a few articles that lined up with how I wanted to look at metagaming, and one of them was actually by Richard Garfield, which was pretty cool. Speaking of tabletop games, while they definitely were present in the body of research, I think that they're underrepresented. Given the highly social nature of most tabletop games, they should absolutely be utilized more in gaming communication research, especially within the context of studying metachat and metagaming. Communication theory needs to be human focused, meaning focus more on the people who are doing the communicating rather than media through which that they're doing it. Examining metachat between players, as well as the construction and maintenance of a larger metagame, is no exception. In their paper on self-determination theory, Ryan et al. Stated that they believe the most practical motivational models will be those that address fundamental psychological and motivational dynamics rather than deconstructing specific instances of games or genres. Studying metachat and metagaming will naturally provide some focus on the human element of communication and also provide some amount of distance from the media itself. I ended up using self-determination theory and ecological gameplay learning because they were theories that worked well together the best to answer the basic questions I wanted to ask about metachat relative to Magic. There is so much more room for more complex questions and theories to step in. Future studies could utilize dynamic human-centered communication systems theory to examine how a player's familiarity with game effects. Future studies could utilize dynamic human-centered communication systems theory to examine how players' familiarity with a game affects their ability to build community and share their expertise with other players. Uses and gratifications could have a very similar use to how I used STT here in determining why people play these games and why they participate in metachat. When it comes to metagaming in general, I think user avatar bond could have some very interesting findings with regard to tabletop role-playing games when it comes to forming bonds with their characters outside of the game. The theoretical contributions this study would make, the most obvious one is that I am taking theories that have been applied to digital gaming and reapplying them to tabletop trading card games. So I'm using them in a different context to see what shakes out. Additionally, collecting data from players on why they play Magic and why they engage metachat, as well as observing them play and engage in this behavior, would yield useful data that would help explain the metachat phenomenon. Comparing gameplay and deck building outcomes by players who do and don't engage in metachat, if possible, would be an important first step in finding out how exactly it affects players' gameplay and their social dynamics. Ultimately, the social dynamics that exist in and around games and tabletop contexts is potentially an area that is ripe with opportunities to craft human-centered communication theories that aren't dependent on a specific media or genre. And to be somewhat hypocritical, Magic is a particularly valuable medium to explore these theories because it's extremely popular. It has a rich, deep metagame, but most importantly, it's a game that cannot exist without multiple, distinct, but permeable local contexts in which to play it. And each of these metas have their own dynamic ecosystems of players and strategies. To put it bluntly, without the gathering, there is no magic. To put it wistfully, maybe the real magic was the friends we made along the way. Thank you.